Hi, my name is Mike Marcella. I've been a police officer for almost 30 years. I started my career in 1979 in a village called Fox Lake, and I worked myself east all the way to Lake Michigan, where I worked several different departments, some multiple departments at the same time, to where I finally retired as a deputy chief of police for the village of Park City. In each department I worked as hard as I could and ended up moving up in the ranks and was able to get involved in a lot of different aspects of police work. I always remembered, and as a kid, I always thought about being a police officer. I always thought it was an exciting type of a job. And back when I was a young kid, about 8 years old, my dad was a part-time police officer for the town we lived in Lindenhurst, and he and the people he worked with, I used to always see them get together and they'd talk things and they'd tell stories, and I always thought it was an exciting type of thing. And one of the guys my dad worked with, I just kind of admired a lot, and I thought that's what I wanted to be like. And I knew when I was 21 years old I was going to apply for police jobs. I turned 21, and the first department I applied for happened to be Fox Lake. There was 15 people who applied for that position, and there was 3 positions available. I ended up getting number 1 on the list, got hired at 21 years old, and my career actually started then. I was very lucky to get good training officers. I worked in departments that were very active. From a standpoint of a police officer, there's nothing worse than being a cop and being bored to death. And I didn't have those issues where I worked. I always seemed to work in departments where things were constantly happening. And back then, police school was a 6-week period. But they had 6 months before they had to send you to this academy. And there was no openings at that time, so I worked the street for the first 6 months. So I immediately started on a midnight shift. I had an excellent training officer. I had 2 weeks of training. The training consisted of the boundaries of the village, how to read the law books to know how to charge people, how to do reports, mock traffic stops until I got comfortable with it. Then they let me make real traffic stops where the police officer stood behind me. After my 2-week training, I was cut loose in a squad by myself, working the midnight shift. Was given a lot of calls. That's the way you learn. You do. There was always somebody there to make sure I wasn't making a mistake and that I was doing pretty much the right thing. I became more comfortable with what I had to do. For example, traffic. I said, okay, I looked at the law and it said, failure to yield turning left. And I would read that traffic law and I would say to myself, okay, where in my village can I go find that? And I'll sit and watch for it to happen. And then once it happened, I would make a traffic stop on it and I would write a citation and I would complete that learning process. And that's how I learned most of the traffic laws. And I became so in tune to that type of thing that they were calling me the walking IVC, which was the Illinois Vehicle Code book, because I read it so much. I had some good training people with radars. There's an art to using a radar gun. Radar guns, if you know what you're doing with them, you can, in a row of cars going down the street, you can actually pick out each car and get a different speed out of it and know which vehicle is doing the speeding and which is not. After doing it enough times, you can actually pick out a car and see a car and know it's speeding and almost come with an exact speed when you put the radar gun on it. And so I think he's doing 59 and 35, and sure enough, after a while you see radar gun would be on it and you would see 59 miles an hour. So it became like of a game. I always was an aggressive patrolman, meaning that I was always looking for some violation of some type, whether it was traffic or criminal, or that was my job. My job was to seek out the bad people. And back when I first started, cars were fast and roads were wide open and people didn't want to get tickets. And we were constantly having car chases. It would be nothing for me to drive up and down the streets on a midnight shift with no lights on, and you'd be surprised at what you see when people don't see you first. And it gave me an opportunity to arrest a lot of burglars on view. People breaking into homes or into businesses, and I made a lot of arrests for that at night. Driving down, checking my businesses at night, rattling doors, find an open door, open it up, go inside, find out there's a burglary happening. I remember one night I was getting off work. I was working the afternoon shift. I lived 20 miles away. It was a rough day, busy night, a lot of calls, and I decided to stop and grab a cup of coffee before I was on my way home. So as I was driving down the main street downtown, I happened to, just out of habit, look over to the right as I was passing this one store, and it had huge window fronts. And I went past it, and I shook my head, and I stopped the car, and I backed up, and I thought, something's not right. It looked wrong. So when I backed up, I looked inside the store, and I realized that the cash register was no longer on the counter where it was earlier that day. So without thinking, I immediately got out of my car, still in uniform, with no communications for the police department. We didn't have cell phones or anything at that time. And I got out of the car, and I walked up to the front door, and I pulled on the front door, and the front door opened. And as soon as I looked in the front door, I saw 3 people stand up from behind the counter. They were taking the money out of the register. Without thinking, I ran in there, yelled, "Police, stop!" They got up, ran out towards the back, going through the store. It was a donut shop. And I remember 2 of them had to go through this little corridor, and I happened to catch up to them, and they got through the corridor, and I grabbed this rolling tray, and I pushed it down on top of them. And they fell to the ground, and I ended up grabbing 2 of them inside the store, and I got handcuffs on them, and I handcuffed them to the benches. I grabbed the phone, I called 911, and I called the police department. I said, "Hey, it's me, I'm at so-and-so donut shop. I just had a burglary. I got 2 in custody, and 1 ran out the back door." Next thing I know, squad cars came from everywhere. So they ended up taking the 2 in custody that I had, and because of the 2 we had in custody, the officers who were there knew who the 3rd one was because they always hung together. A short period later, the officers went to that house and they found a 3rd guy. I identified him as the guy in the store, and we made the arrest. I've always been the kind of person, if you believe that if you really like something a lot, you're going to excel at it. Well, I loved what I was doing, and I really excelled at it because I loved it. I had 6 burglars on view my first 6 months as a police officer. When I went to the academy, they made it a point to tell the class that in a 20-year career, you'll be lucky to catch 1 burglar in that 20 years as an on-view situation, and I already had 6. So it was, again, all those things helped make me realize that this is what I wanted to do the rest of my life.
What's the worst injury that's happened to you?
I've had my share of injury. I've been stabbed twice. I've been shot at, been beat up, been wrecked in car accidents, almost run over. I remember trying to arrest a drunk driver one time. He tried to pin me between his car and a telephone pole. So when I pushed myself away from his car, I had my flashlight in my hand, and it broke his driver's window. And the window shattered and shredded the bottom of my finger, cut the nerve, the tendon, and the artery. And I was bleeding pretty good. But I ended up effecting the arrest, called for help, and Waukegan sent some officers to help me. And one of the officers showed up as a friend of mine, and he was all panicked because I was bleeding so bad. He taken me to the hospital. They ended up stopping the bleeding, and I had to have surgery. And he gave me grief for bleeding all over his car. So I'd say that's probably the worst injury I've ever had. Plus the car accident, I got messed up pretty good in a car accident one time in Fox Lake. But
what happened there?
I was just, day before Christmas, I was going to do a lockout, unlock a guy who left the keys in a car. And I was just driving down Route 12, just getting ready to go over the bridge. And the roads were dry, but the bridges in the whole area were glare ice. And there was a lady going the opposite direction of a 4-lane highway on the bridge on Route 12. And something was wrong with her steering, and she knew it, but she knew there was a gas station on the other side of the bridge. So she kept going, and she started to speed up to get to the other side, and she ended up losing control of it. Her car started to spin, and I saw this car coming at me. And I ended up pulling over all the way to the right lane, and I knew I was going to get hit. And I grabbed my microphone and I said, Squad 256, listen to this. And she hit me, and the next thing I remember, I had glass in my eyes, and I was bleeding pretty good. And I remember seeing a semi-truck coming up behind me, so I'm reaching for the dash, trying to find the switches. I figured I'd turn my lights on to slow everybody down. I flipped the switch on, and I could hear this lady moaning in her car. And I told her, stay in your car, you know. And I finally cleared the glass out of my eyes, and I realized my lights, floodlights, had come off the top of the car and were hanging by the wires off the side of the car, and they were going around and around. They kept calling me about this accident, but I didn't answer. They finally realized I was involved in it. I was the only one working, so they ended up calling the county to come out and take this accident report, and I ended up in the hospital and totaled a brand new squad car. So in about after being a police officer at Fox Lake for almost 4 years, and it wasn't making a lot of money. I was only making back then like $12,000 a year, which was not a lot of money. I decided to try other departments, larger departments, where I had an opportunity to do the things I was enjoying, investigations. I ended up applying for another department called Round Lake Beach Police Department. I was hired there after doing the testing. I was also retrained there. Each department has what's called a training officer, and they want to make sure that you follow their procedures and their paperwork and that type of stuff. So I was fortunate enough to have an excellent training officer. I was with him for 2 weeks. We worked a midnight shift together, and it was a very busy community. A lot of burglaries, a lot of domestics, a lot of bar fights, a lot of thefts, and there were some openings that came up in the department for a crime scene technician or an evidence technician, and I put in for it, and I was lucky enough that they gave me an opportunity to go to school for it. I came back and became the department's evidence technician, which meant that every major crime that happened, I would get called in and I would go through the scene, and I would take photographs and fingerprints and, castings and whatever needed to be done at the type of crime it was. And I did that for another year. Actually for the rest of my career. Once I was trained, it just kept getting easier and easier to do. I had an opportunity. Our department just got a new chief and decided they wanted to try a canine program because it was cheaper than hiring police officers. And we were a busy community, and it was figured that a dog was like having 2 extra hands out there. So I applied for the canine position as well, and I was lucky enough that I was able to get picked for that, one of 3 guys. So the department was able to enroll us and the dogs in obedience school. And basically what they did was they taught us how to train the dogs. And that was about a 6-week process for basic obedience training. And like everything else I seem to do, I put my heart and soul into it, and I worked my dog constantly.
And it never stops because the non-stop news machine is powered by non-stop people. The largest news-gathering team in television, cable or otherwise.
Reagan is also involved in some overseas...
The world doesn't stop, and no, the news doesn't stop. On Satellite News Channel, the non-stop news machine. Give us 18 minutes, we'll give you the world.
Welcome back to Your Chance to Live. We're talking with Officer Mike Marcella and Sergeant Carr of the Round Lake Beach Police Department about the dogs that they have over in their department now. Welcome to Your Chance to Live, gentlemen. And I guess the first thing that we should kind of talk about is how this program of adding dogs to the Round Lake Beach Police Department gets started.
All right. We originally started the program because of a lack of manpower. The dogs supplement our manpower. It was started by Chief Pasquini. When he came to the department, he knew the value of dogs and how they could help a small department. The only trouble was trying to find enough money, etc., to start this program.
It's always the way, isn't it, in government?
Yes, it is.
Mike, we found out from Bob here that how the program got started. Where did you get these dogs from?
Well, all the dogs we have had several dogs in the past.
We ended up with donated dogs. We couldn't afford to spend the money to purchase dogs. So we went through probably 10 or 15 dogs, and we learned how to test them to see if they would be suitable for law enforcement.
Not every dog can be a police canine dog. There are certain things. They check for hip dysplasia, bad hips, whether a dog is scared of people or vicious towards people. The dogs we're looking for police canine program would be a dog that likes everybody, especially kids. So we don't have any problem with the dogs biting kids or people that aren't supposed to be bit. There are parts of the training for the obedience alone, the basic obedience, is that where they have cats running around, other dogs, all kinds of distractions, airplanes.
Oh, yeah?
You want the dog to be able to listen to you and only you. You don't want any distractions. So if you're in a field with somebody, attempting to locate somebody in a field, or in a building search, and say a cat runs out, or a young kid runs out, you don't want the dog to do anything but what you told him to do. So a lot of it's mostly repetition, and there's a lot of reinforcing your commands. Each handler is assigned a dog. No one else is a handler to that dog. We have 3 dogs.
So if you have 3 dogs, you have 3 handlers.
And we have 3 shifts, basically.
When we first got our dogs, they were just about over the puppy stage. They couldn't even sit. They were... some of them came from kennels, no commands, they had no obedience training whatsoever.
Who trains the dogs?
The dogs don't need to be trained. The handlers have to be trained so that the handlers know what to tell the dogs. The dogs themselves seem to have the intelligence that they know what to do. We just have to direct them.
I named the dog Blackjack. I wanted to name him some other things, and the chief said, no, we can't have you naming him those names. A blackjack is an old-time term for a strap that the policemen used to carry that had lead shot inside of it, and they used to use it like a billy club. And they used to call that a blackjack. And I just thought that was a kind of a neat name, and it stuck with him. Everywhere I went, the dog went with me. He was like my best friend. He became probably the top dog out of the 3 we had.
The dog will do anything his handler orders him to do. He could immediately start another attack.
I have to interrupt her to look at that little girl sitting down there, and why that dog is... What's the dog's name?
That dog is Blackjack.
Blackjack looks like he's having a heck of a good time with that little gal.
He likes to be scratched just like any good dog. There's, like I say, there's no danger at all to anyone once the handler has the dog off of the attack. It's all done by word of mouth and command.
And he was a good dog. He was a quiet dog. But he did everything I wanted him to do. He was like turning on a light switch. Would go to a bar fight. I'd walk in the bar with the dog on a leash, and I'd drop the leash, and I'd put him on sit at the door, and he'd just sit there and stare at people. And he was quiet. But when he barked, rooms shook. He just had this deep, authoritative bark to him. And we used to have people who used to run up from us all the time. When they'd see a squad car, they'd chase. When they get in foot chases with these guys, all of a sudden they weren't running anymore. And we'd catch them and say, why aren't you running? Because we know you got a dog. We thought you'd send the dog after us. So it was kind of neat. It really worked out the way the department thought it would work. It was almost like having extra hands out there, because just the thought of having a dog out there really curbed a lot of our crimes, because people were afraid that they were going to get caught because of the dogs.
Would normally possibly the officer have his gun out when he's approached him?
Not when he has the dog, because the dog will have the man fully controlled. In this situation, that's the reason you use the dog, is you don't have to use a gun.
You know, he's giving him an order to put his hands up, huh?
That's right, and then he'll walk him back to the car, and then he will, at that point, put the dog on set, and he will finish the apprehension.
He would get excited as I did. If I was just driving around, he'd be laying down on the platform, and he wouldn't even know he was there. But when I would do my business checks at night, he'd be up and he'd be excited. You could see he was looking around outside. He had the windows down, but he never would bark. He was always quiet. And I had to learn different ways to see that he would key into things from his expressions or his way he was, physical attributes he had. And when I would do calls that would excite me, when you have the lights and sirens, you could tell he was just as excited in the back seat. He was all over the back, We had a squad car. Again, everything was donated. We couldn't afford regular canine cars. So we took a regular squad car, took the back seat out of it, put a platform in it, and that was our canine squad. And in between where the dog was, the back seat area, and the front area, was a sliding cage door. And I always remembered I'd have Blackjack, he'd like snacks. So we'd get our tour of duty, I'd put him in the back of the squad car, and I'd get these boxes of dog bones, buy a brand new box, bring with me. And these were the cars that had the hump for the drive shaft, with a bench seat in the front. And I always took that box and I'd put it on top of the hump in front of the bench seat. And every once in a while, Blackjack, while we're driving around, he'd want a dog biscuit. He'd slide that slide window open with his face, and he'd stick his head through there, and he'd breathe down my neck, and I would hand him a dog biscuit, and he'd go back and he'd chew it up, and he'd lay down. Well, one day I remember we got called to do take a report at the station, and it was early in the morning. I probably a couple hours into our shift, and Blackjack was in the back seat, and I left them in there, and I went into the station, and I had bought a brand new box of dog biscuits, and I put it on the hump. And I closed the cage door, and I went in the station. I was in there for about 20 minutes or so, half hour, taking a report. And when I came back out, I got into the squad car, and I noticed all my papers were rustled on the front seat, and dog hair everywhere, and I looked, and the dog box, the biscuits, was about this tall. He had opened the sliding window, jumped into the front seat, ate all the dog biscuits in the brand new doggy biscuit box, chewed the box up, jumped back in the back seat like I didn't do anything. Well, he got sick after that. I had to go clean up the mess, but he was always a character. Everything we did, he's always there. I can remember taking prisoners with me to the station, and the only place to put him was in the front seat. And a lot of people were afraid of dogs, especially just because he was a 150-pound shepherd. He was big. And I'd be driving to the station, and he would slide that door open and shove his head in and breathe down the throat or the neck of the collar of the person I had arrested, and you could just see the terror in this guy's face. And he'd be leaning as far forward as possible to get away from the dog, and the dog wouldn't have hurt him. And then I was training a new officer one day, and I had my dog in a kennel, and he was already working for our department for 3 years, and he was in the back in the kennel, and I ended up going on a fatal motorcycle accident. By the time I got back, I went to check on him. He was in the back in the kennel dead. The chief was afraid that somebody might have poisoned him, so he took the dog and they brought him for like an autopsy for the kennel for animals, and it was determined that he died of what's called bloat. And what that is the stomach usually flips over on larger dogs and it strangles the blood flow to the bowels and the hands. And if you don't catch it right away, there's nothing you can do. They die. Well, it just so happened that morning I was given a demonstration. And he was acting real strange. He was doing what I asked him to do, but I could tell his heart and soul wasn't in it. And what it was his stomach has already flipped over and he was dying. I mean, I didn't realize it, but he was still doing what I wanted him to do. And so I feel bad because I was yelling at him because he wasn't doing what I wanted him to do, and next thing I know, when I come back, he had died. But he was such a good, loyal member of our department that the chief saw how well the public looked at him and the kind of help it was to have him on the police department. And they ended up burying him in a pet cemetery, and they put a placard on his grave for him. They gave me a placard. It was a real nice thing for the public to see as well. So after that, we ended up with a new chief, and he didn't see a need for the canine, in the police department, and they kind of abolished the animals.
How gentle is the dog at this point?
The dog right now will not attack. The dog is as gentle as your normal house puppy at this time.
After several years working for Round Lake Beach Police Department, and I worked part-time for a couple other departments in the area for extra money and because they were short-handed, I decided to move to Arizona. So I quit the police department. I had some other business. I had a business venture going. I sold the shares to my business. I worked as a corporate loss prevention manager for a corporation. I quit all that stuff, gave all the vehicles back, moved to Arizona, and flew airplanes 6 days a week. That's all I did. I didn't work, bought a house with all the money I had from my pension and selling my shares to my business and that. And then at that, I did that for a year. And then my wife got sick and I had to get a job. And I thought, well, okay, what's a guy do? For 10 years I was a cop. What do I do? Well, I went to apply for a Phoenix Police Department, and they had 2 positions available, and they had 1,500 people apply for it. So needless to say, I didn't get the position. And I thought, this is crazy. So what else is there to do? I knew that I needed to go back to Lake County, Illinois, because that's where everything happened for me. And I ended up making a phone call to a police department in Park City, Illinois. And they knew of me, and I had been a cop for 10 years already, and they had a position available, and they hired me over the phone, which is unheard of. So I took 3 days, drove out back here to Illinois. I showed up there, they swore me in, they threw me a set of keys. They said, come back and work midnight shift. And I was by myself. I had no uniform, I didn't know the community. He said, you'll learn it. And I did. I ended up learning it. And I had a lot of help from Waukegan. They were always there if I needed anything. And phone calls if I needed anybody, I could always get help over the phone from the guys I worked with. And then the community started to grow bigger and bigger, and we started ending up adding more police officers, so you weren't one person at a time anymore. But because of my experiences over the years in different departments and doing different things, I was handling things by myself that whole shifts were handling in Waukegan. I'd go to bar fights by myself and handle them. I would do domestics by myself and handle them. Very, very few times we had problems. We worked by ourselves. I remember some pretty nasty weather when major roads were sheer ice, and there's a whole shift of Waukegan that can't do 5 accidents, and I'm doing 10 or 12 by myself. And it's just, you learn things, procedural things to do in a certain way to get things accomplished, and you have to be authoritative and take things in your own hand and move people here and move people there, and it's all comes in time. So after being a cop for 10 years and getting onto this department in Park City, I had a lot of experience because I worked by myself, taking a lot of reports, and investigations always was something I enjoyed doing. Building cases from nothing, finding out the evidence and seeing where it would lead and talking to people and interviewing and putting a puzzle together. And it was a smaller department, so I had the opportunity to be able to do a lot of investigation, follow-up work. My chief would give me things to do. Each time I did it, I would if I was stuck with something, I'd talk to somebody who had more experience than I did. They'd give me suggestions. I'd go back at it, and pretty soon I became very good at it. People talked to me. I had an ability to get people to open up. And I did that for the rest of my career as a police officer. I did investigations. I also worked up through the ranks. I became a sergeant, a detective sergeant. I was able to get on a lot of different task forces. I became a member of the gang crimes task force, arson task force, major crime task force. I was an investigative specialist, a crime scene technician, a juvenile officer. I did a lot of death investigations, a lot of autopsies, a lot of suicides. We had homicides, a lot of fire deaths, car accident deaths, and all those things. There's always somebody else expecting answers, and my job was to get all the information together so those answers could come out. When I was on the gang task force, we used to go from community to community that needed help with their gangs. I was known as the local expert about our gangs in our town. If other departments had information that led them to some of our gang members involved in something, they would come to me and they would ask questions, and I would be able to give them hopefully the information they needed, or who might be involved in it because of different things. I learned to read and understand gang graffiti. That's a billboard for the gang members. It tells other members and other gang factions what's going on in the gang life. And it's an art to read those things, an art to understand those things. And I ended up generating a computer program that I used. It was for something else, and I utilized it for all our gang members in our town, and it worked out to be pretty good. So when other departments would come to me and say, hey, I need this information on a gang member, I'd be able to pull it up. I had all that information on these individual people, as much as I could legally get from them, and put it in this computer system. And we would get called out from different communities they'd have problems like Buffalo Grove days. They anticipated having some gang issues, and our task force got called out there, and turned out there was like 500 gangbangers out there, and they ended up in a big fight in a football field, and it just escalated, and we ended up getting that broken down, made some arrests, and that type of thing is what we did as a gang task force. We did a lot of gangs, there was a lot of drugs. We did a lot of search warrants, a lot of gang search warrants because of weapons involved in different things, bombs. We got bombs out of safes, and a lot of kicking in doors, a lot of taking names, a lot of fun. Finally, after doing that, I got promoted to sergeant, and I got recognized for things like solving armed robberies, solving death investigations, solving homicides. We got homicides where people were killed, stabbed with potato peelers, and shootings, deaths, and knives. Just a lot of homicides, a lot of sexual assault cases got solved. And most of that is from being able to read people, able to gain their confidence, get their ability to relax and be comfortable with talking to you. And I was very successful at it. There's a big load off of people's chests when they confess to a crime. People who really are sorry for what they did. Out of a 30-year career, I probably had less than 10 fingers worth of trials that actually went to trial. And all the other arrests were most likely either they just pled guilty because the evidence proved that they were guilty, or Monty Hall, let's make a deal time with the state's attorney's office, which made me very proud because the state's attorney then realized the type of police officer I was, and I would go for warrants or something. They never questioned anything I had to do. They knew that once I asked for something, that I had enough evidence to be able to obtain that. And it worked good with me and the state's attorney's office for prosecuting. I became very well known with judges. I've had judges in open court tell defense attorneys that my credibility was impeccable because of the amount of time that they've known me and watched the type of police officer I had become. There's nothing quite like getting a pat on the back or getting an award at some village hall meeting, and I've got a lot of those. When you stand up and you get an award from your chief of police or a mayor or a village board who thinks you did an outstanding job on a homicide case or a sexual assault case to take people off the streets, and the public is there, and you get an applaud by these people who really and truly appreciate what you've done, it makes it all worth it. It's a good feeling to know that you make changes in people's lives. And in 2004, I ended up having a situation where I made a traffic stop on a guy, got into a struggle with him, and I wasn't that bad out of shape, but I was a smoker. I got a little bit winded fighting with this guy, so I decided I better quit smoking, and I went to the doctor and tried to get some help for quitting smoking, and he had me do a stress test, and it all went downhill from there. I ended up having a quad bypass, which ended my police career. I was 3 months away from being the chief. It was very devastating for me after all those years of doing what I loved. I reached every goal I ever met. I retired as deputy chief of police and but collecting a pension since. I was lucky enough to have an opportunity, several jobs after that. I was advised of a position available as a 911 dispatcher for a community in Wisconsin. It's like a 4-month process with background checks and all. And I went in and I spoke with the chief of police there for about 30 minutes, discussing my background and my what I was involved in, what I had done over the years, and they hired me in 4 days. So I was pretty lucky with that too. And then I was there for just under 5 years and ended up with a triple bypass. I guess that's nature's way of saying it's time to get out of law enforcement. So I'm now driving a school bus. And that's my life as a cop. I guess in a recap, I'm just going to say that I loved what I did. I took pride in what I did. First 5 years as a cop, I used to tell everybody it's the best job in the world. You change your feelings. I used to tell people after that, you don't want to do this job, even though I loved it. I see people today that are in school to learn law enforcement issues, and I tell them now, don't do this, be a lawyer. But again, I wouldn't change what I did, other than health issues. I would probably take better care of myself in hindsight if I had known better, but it was quite devastating for me to not be a cop anymore. And it was an exciting job for me. And a lot of the excitement was because I strived at doing more. I pushed myself to be able to do other things. I got involved with a lot of stuff. But things suffered for it. My family life suffered for it. My career just catapulted. And I loved it, but I was working 18, 20-hour days. There's no holidays. To this day, we don't celebrate holidays because I never had them. I always worked them. And then when I was up high enough in ranks to where I didn't have to, I would go in the station and send everybody home, and that was my gift to them. I'd work the street by myself, so that's probably the hardest thing about it is the hours. The family life suffers. It really does. It was my life. I loved every minute of it. There were some things I didn't like about it, but I put my heart and soul into it and my entire life into it. It's not for everybody. It's not. But I wouldn't do it any different.